Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording on the 10th of December, the afternoon of the 10th of December, and this is episode 22. It's going to be the last one for the year. So thank you for those of you who've stuck with us and have been listening since we started in April, and you've put up with the two of us. Anyway, Jen, how are things? What's been keeping you busy?
We're very excited about episode 22 of Maritime Matters. Sad that we're wrapping up for the year, but also excited to be going on holiday. So that's great. What's been keeping me busy? I can't remember the last time we recorded this, so I might be doubling up. But I'm going to take double credit anyway. I had a piece out on export controls, something different, defence export controls. So that's out on the ECAG website. We'll share a link to that website. I've been talking a bit about the Australia-China defence relationship. I had a piece in the Fin Review. And since we spoke, I did an online launch of the Coast Guard paper. I was joined by Andrew Tillett from the AFR, Professor Beck Stratting from Latrobe Asia, and Rear Admiral Lee Goddard, retired, who's a former commander of MBC. So that recording will be available on the Maritime Matters channel.
Excellent. Well, firstly, congratulations on the Coast Guard paper. It's excellent, well worth a read for anyone who's interested in these kind of topics. It's certainly something that will give you quite a lot to chew on, and hopefully we'll build up a bit of a conversation on these kind of issues, because there's certainly something here that we need to be nutting through. I've been not doing anything like as exciting kind of naval-related, maritime-related stuff as you've been up to. But hopefully, as I said before, my piece on stuffed ships taken up from trade will be out soon, and I'll flag that for anyone who might be interested or follows me on social media and things. Anyway, moving on.
Excited to read that, given that Australia currently has no operational replenishment ships whatsoever. This is an exciting, we're using the word exciting a lot. None of this is actually exciting, but it's certainly interesting. It's an interesting topic to discuss.
Well, it would be if we had any ships to take up from trade. So the absence of the replenishment ships and the absence of the ships to take up from trade perhaps speaks to a wider problem.
Well, we may soon. Now, glass half full. We haven't got this in this episode, so we're not really going to talk about it in detail, and I'm not prepped, so I might get my facts wrong. But I'm pretty sure just over a week ago, the tenders for the first ships to be part of the strategic fleet the Australian government has announced closed. So hopefully next year we'll be hearing some more about that. That will be, I'll keep wanting to say exciting. It's definitely not exciting. It will be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's certainly interesting to see what happens and how this fits into the wider picture, and whether or not, frankly, government is serious about doing this. And obviously, the upcoming federal election might also feature in some of this stuff. How and whether a potential change of government makeup might sort of affect the defence more widely, but also issues like this, which involve government subsidies and government investment into private industry, and that has not only defence sides, but also quite a lot of economic and more almost ideological challenges for certain elements of government. So, yeah, lots of interesting things to keep an eye on there. Anyway, what's been happening in the region?
Well, there have been some more incidents around Scarborough Shoal. Now, we've spoken about Scarborough Shoal a fair bit through the season. Scarborough Shoal, just to situate ourselves, is 240 kilometres from the Philippines island of Luzon. It's well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, although it has been under China's control since 2012. Now, we won't go into the background. I think we did you know on this at one point. We've seen the Philippines attempt to resupply the fishermen around Scarborough Shoal with one of their government fisheries vessels. And we're seeing kind of the same behaviour from China. So this was last Wednesday the 4th of December. We've seen kind of the writing off behaviour, the use of water cannons, and that kind of aggressive behavior towards the Philippines. The Philippines have lodged a diplomatic note against China. This is like the 200th for the year. So I guess this is fairly consistent with the behavior we've seen this year, predominantly around Second Thomas Shoal for kind of the first half of the year, then around Sabina Shoal, now around Scarborough Shoal. It is fairly consistent. I think one of the things that is interesting on it, though, is it's not making the news as much as it was kind of at the beginning of the year. So these same behaviours. And in some ways, I think maybe people are becoming a little acclimatised to the fact this is happening. What's your take on the latest incidents around Scarborough Shoal?
Yeah, so I think you're right. People are becoming acclimatized to it. Going back to the boiling the frog analogy that again we've mentioned before, right? This is the more the Chinese do it, the more we see video footage of water cannoning and effectively ramming by often larger Chinese vessels. The first time you see it, it sort of incites shock and surprise and everything else. But when you see it for the 15th or 20th time, naturally people become accustomed to it and expect it to happen. And as you say, it doesn't seem to be registering in quite the same way in the mainstream media. There was some quite interesting, or there was perhaps a slight difference in tone, I think, coming from different elements of the Philippine government around this, which again I think is interesting to see about the degree to which this is seen as sort of an aggressive act. And some of the language being used, which I think, and again, I think we've mentioned this briefly before about the different government bodies and the politics within that, which is something not only in the Philippines, but we often tend to view foreign states as being single sort of unified blocks, and actually there's quite a lot of politics and dynamics going on inside that as well. But I don't think we're going to see any significant shift to the status quo. And as you say, what is it the 200th note or something of the year? It shows the kind of pattern of behaviour that has effectively established itself, certainly over the year and going back beyond that in the South China Sea.
Yeah, and speaking of kind of in the same region, we had kind of some reporting out of the Philippines regarding some concerns. So the Philippines detected a Russian submarine. It was the UFA, probably pronounced very badly, which is, so UFA, UFA. I mean, how would you pronounce UFA?
I would have gone with exactly the same, but my Russian is the square root of 0, so I have no idea. It's true.
Anyway, it's an improved version of the Kilo-class submarine. It was commissioned in 2022. Naval News have a pretty good piece on it. So it was detected in the Philippines exclusive economic zone last Thursday. It was about 148 kilometres from the Philippines. Why are we talking about this? Look, I think it's interesting in terms of some of the comments that were made. We've got to fill a 45-minute podcast, but also it's also interesting some of the comments that were made around this, right? So we saw the president of the Philippines make a comment that it was concerning that the submarine was operating there, and followed up by a comment about any intrusion into the West Philippine Sea or our exclusive economic zone of our baselines is very worrisome. So yes, this is just another one. Now, it looks like the way that the Philippines detected it was literally on the surface. The Philippines vessel that detected it, which I'm assuming was a Navy vessel, called it up, had a radio conversation with it. The submarine identified themselves, and it sounds like it was a pretty pleasant conversation. But I just kind of wanted to highlight this kind of view of how we talk about international maritime law. So warships and submarines can operate in countries' exclusive economic zones. There is no prohibition on that. There are some countries that try and impose a prohibition on that. China is an example, but they're not the only example. But that's actually not in accordance with UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So there is absolutely no reason that a Russian submarine can't be operating in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. And the submarine itself is based in Vladivostok, which is the Pacific Fleet base for Russia. It looks like it's been visiting in Kota Kinabalu, the naval base there. It looks like it's done some training and interactions. There's some reporting about a passage exercise. Submarines don't normally do passage exercises, but that implies that it's done on the surface. But with the Malaysian Navy, but also a visit to Surabaya in Indonesia in November this year, an early visit in October to India. So this is kind of standard operations. But I just kind of wanted to highlight it because there was a lot of talk about it on social media. There was some, What are they doing there? How dare they? We saw the comments from the president of the Philippines about, the kind of incursion idea into exclusive economic zone, but actually, in accordance with international law, submarines can operate in exclusive economic zones, and they can even do so dived if they wish to. There's no distinction there. Of course, in a territorial sea, which is 12 nautical miles from the baseline of a coastal state, broadly, submarines do need to operate on the surface, but outside of that, no. So I just kind of thought it was worth kind of digging into that because there was a bit of interest in it in social media.
Absolutely. I think it's a key example of the occasional double standards that we see in what I guess we would see as the Western aligned states around quite a lot of this sort of stuff. And you saw similar kind of stuff a little while ago when the Russians turned up. There was a Russian submarine operating off the east coast of the United States, and there was a big hullabaloo again on social media. God, what are they doing? Well, they're doing exactly the same thing they've done for the past 80 years, and we do to them all the time. There is absolutely no issue here at all. I think in some ways the more interesting story is the fact that this is a brand new SSK, which is transiting out from where it was built I think in St. Petersburg, and is actually going to operate with the Russian Pacific Fleet. We often kind of forget, to a degree, the fact that the Russians have a reasonably capable fleet based in the Pacific. And actually, despite the huge strains that are taking place in Russia, both in terms of the war and the economy, etc., that they are actually building up to a degree that fleet, or at least modernizing the capability, even if not increasing numbers. So I think that's interesting. And obviously the exercises conducted by the Malaysians, Malaysia and sort of Malaysia's position within ASEAN and within the wider region is I think, again, something that is worth keeping an eye on. They are very much sort of sitting on the fence, and the willingness to engage in relatively, I guess, sensitive exercises, submarine to submarine exercises, are not something that you conduct with anyone. So, take you.
Well, maybe. I mean, so I agree with you on almost everything, but I wouldn't suggest, from the reporting, says the passage exercise implies it's conducted on the surface. It's really two submarines just sailing next to each other on the surface. So I wouldn't consider that really a sensitive exercise. But I agree with you on everything else. The only reason I say that is because people tend to read so much into these things. You'll see a report tomorrow saying Malaysia and Russia are enhancing their interoperability, in submarine capability, and that would be a significant stretch in terms of what it looks like actually happening.
The only pushback I'd say is how many other places do Russian submarines go and conduct exercises with? The list is not as long as it perhaps once might have been.
Well, maybe, but how much do we actually pay attention to it as well? I mean, the only reason anyone's paid attention to this passage exercise between the Russian submarine and the Malaysian exercise is in the context of the comments from the president of the Philippines in terms of the submarine being detected in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. Certainly, every article I've read on it starts with "There's a submarine in the Philippines exclusive economic zone," and then it goes down and says, "And they didn't exercise Malaysia, and they went to Indonesia, etc." So maybe, but I can't honestly say I turned my mind to it enough to be able to provide any data.
Fair cop on that one.
We have to disagree because we've stopped talking about sending ships to the Red Sea. There has been something that we disagree on.
Still more
Anyway.
China Sea stuff?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you go.
No, you go.
You'd think we'd be better at this at episode 22. We're not. But yeah, so I guess probably linked to the commentary provided about what happened at Scarborough Shoal last week on Wednesday, the 4th of December. We did see in fairly quick succession to that what looks like a probable response from the US, Japan, and the Philippines. So they've conducted some sort of joint patrol, is the terminology they're calling it. There was a US reconnaissance aircraft, I'm assuming it was a P-8, but wasn't in the reporting. And a Japanese and a Philippines Navy ship conducted a joint patrol on Friday, so 2 days after the incident around Scarborough Shoal. The joint patrol was about 40 kilometres from Scarborough Shoal. And there was a statement afterwards that talked about the aim of this was to uphold the right of freedom of navigation and overflight. 40 nautical miles, not 40 kilometres. It's about 74 kilometres from Scarborough Shoal. And I highlight this because We are seeing a trend, I think, in terms of when we do see these incidents from China, we are seeing some sort of joint patrol or maritime cooperative activity. I think that's what it was called. I don't know. I remember jumping up in arms. It's not the worst name. Exercise Maritime Big Play is the worst name. But we're seeing some sort of trilateral or quadrilateral response quite quickly in the maritime domain, which is kind of a demonstration, for want of a better term, in response to sending a message. So I think it's interesting to note that this happened 2 days later, and it does, I mean, it might have been planned a couple of weeks beforehand, but it does look like it was an immediate response to China's behaviour around Scarborough Shoal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the key point, is, as you kind of flagged there, is that, and again, I would need to run the numbers, but certainly my sense is that there's been a notable shift from this being where there were responses. It was primarily an American one earlier in the year. I think we're now seeing much more consistent multilateral. Japan has notably really kind of have stepped up, and to a lesser degree Australia as well. And we've seen the Canadians doing things there. Quite a lot of people or other nations are getting involved. So I think there's certainly a kind of more multilateral engagement on this issue than perhaps we've seen previously.
Yeah, absolutely. We did mention New Zealand as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Was involved in one of them and warrants a significant mention. Speaking of responses in terms of exercise responses, and I guess one of the key themes that we've seen this year and probably last year is that this idea of using a maritime exercise, a naval exercise, to send a key message in response to something. And we've seen that with Exercise Joint Sword, Alpha and Bravo, which is the Chinese, the PLA exercises that have occurred in the vicinity of Taiwan this year. One in response to the inauguration of the president of Taiwan, and the other one in response to, I think it was his National Day address, etc. I raise this because there's some reporting coming out of Taiwan in the last 24 hours about a surge of PLA aircraft and PLA ships in the vicinity of Taiwan, and a view that there may be a joint sword Charlie equivalent potentially. Now, the reporting is that this is kind of in response to the president of Taiwan's visit to Hawaii, and then to a number of states in the Pacific that still have diplomatic relationships with Taiwan, of which I think there are only about 3 now, since Nauru switched earlier this year. Now, when President Lai actually visited Hawaii, there was reporting from Taiwan at the time that they thought there would be a major PLA exercise in response. We've seen no commentary from the PLA on this, but that's fairly standard, to be honest. It kind of comes out during and after the exercise. But certainly the reporting from Taiwan that they're seeing a surge in assets around Taiwan and expecting another major exercise.
Again, fitting into all of these kind of patterns, and there's obviously going to be the usual kind of discussion about whether or not, or how this might be a presage to something more. I doubt very much that it is, but it does seem to be these kind of quite consistent signalling and a use of particularly naval assets, but naval and air assets for defence signalling purposes and wider kind of defence diplomacy, which is not by any means unusual, but the degree to which it is happening in our region at the moment, I think, is pretty unprecedented, certainly since the end of the Cold War, if not before that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't, there is this theory that there'll be a joint sword equivalent exercise that turns into something else. I would say most certainly not a month before the US switches over presidents. That would make no strategic sense. So I think that unlikely. But of course, there more than certainly will be some sort of exercise. I guess it's worthwhile talking about now. We kind of try and limit this to the Indo-Pacific and pick our conversations. It probably is just worth flagging that there have been some developments in the Black Sea. Just going back to that theme that increasingly we've seen this trend over the last couple of years of this really contested maritime domain, from South China Sea to the Red Sea to the Baltic to the Black Sea. We've seen a bit of a development in terms of the Ukrainian use of uncrewed surface vessels. There have been a number of attacks in the last week with Ukraine security forces using USVs against gas platforms in Crimea. And this is part of an intensification of attacks on Crimea and also some attacks on the Kerch Bridge. What is interesting about this is it looks like it's the first time we've seen the Ukrainian Sea Baby drone, which is part of a family of USVs that Ukraine has developed and operated. But it looks like it's the first time we've seen this actually using probably remotely operated. It's not entirely clear in the reporting, but I'm going to assume remotely operated machine guns on the Sea Baby. Now, earlier this year, we did see some footage of a surface-to-air missile having been fitted to the Sea Baby. And now we've seen this evolution. So it's clear that Ukraine are continuing to experiment with types of capabilities they can achieve with the USVs.
Yeah, so this certainly is interesting, and the question around how we arm these things and what do they do, I think it has been a question for a while. And one of the other things with this is that for quite a while, the aviation has been seen as an obvious kind of response, and you've only got to look at the successes that helicopters have had against Houthi USVs in the Red Sea to see the kind of potential there. You stick a surface-to-air missile or a heavy machine gun on one of these kind of things, and all of a sudden, helicopters or other air assets are going to be far more reticent about engaging. So that kind of potential arms race in this kind of space is interesting. I guess I'd also kind of flag again in Europe and USV related. There's been some talk, and this was must have been just after our last podcast, about coming off the back of the damage to the cables in the Baltic that NATO have been discussing how they can potentially use USVs and longer term UUVs for more persistent kind of surveillance and basically being able to understand what is happening in the maritime domain. Admiral Vandier, who's the Alliance's sort of in charge of concepts and transformation, described it as being able to do something like street lighting with USVs. So this idea of being able to basically have a picture of what's going on the whole time using these kind of persistent technologies. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on here. I think both of us remain, to a degree, skeptical about some of this, but I think it's definitely a space that's really interesting to see it evolve and evolve so fast.
Yeah, and I completely agree. We have not mentioned that New Zealand, I think, has actually recently purchased some Osseous blue bottles. Speaking of USVs, which is something we should have talked about. If we're talking about the Black Sea, we should be talking about our cousins across the ditch. Some of which do listen to this, by the way. Yeah, in the last week. So in terms of that theme of kind of the development of USVs and the idea of them being used for this persistent surveillance, both above the surface, but also, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in terms of, there's been trials with, I think potentially a tow rays on the back of blue bottles, but certainly on the back of the Sea Hunter, which is kind of a much larger USV, in terms of how they might be able to assist with that underwater domain awareness, something that's generally been the realm of more technically capable vessels. That wasn't great articulation, but it is December. So yeah, so New Zealand has just acquired some Osseous blue bottles as well to kind of get into this USV game. So worth noting. Very different to the Sea Baby, by the way. If you're not across USVs, don't be confusing those two things. Quite different. Anyway, speaking of the difference, capability. So there has been some developments in terms of naval capability for Australia, which I think is pretty. We've used the word exciting about 7 times, and none of it's actually exciting. I'm sure it was exciting for the crew of Brisbane to fire a Tomahawk. Do you want to talk about the Tomahawk developments?
So it was only announced. It was announced yesterday, wasn't it? That Brisbane.
In the last 24 hours, we found out.
So we've known for a little while that Australia is acquiring Tomahawks for the RAN, and Brisbane, as part of a kind of a wider, what's described as test and evaluation activity taking place off the US, has successfully fired a Tomahawk for the first time. Why does this matter? Well, we talk quite a lot about, and we've been perhaps somewhat critical of some of the discussion of long-range strike and the ability of the Australian Defence Force to do impactful projection or whatever kind of.
I hate that term. I hate that term so much. What is impactful projection?
Who knows?
Anyway,
it's one of. The only one I hate more is the big question marks, which I've got as sort of these huge floating things that people talk about in terms of AUKUS submarines. But anyway.
I have one more annoying for you too, actually. I thought you were about to mention, which is why I smiled and laughed. But up there with impactful projection is interchangeability deployments, which is what HMAS Brisbane's deployment has been explained as. That's not a thing. But anyway, go back to the exciting thing that is a thing, which is the Tomahawk firing.
So why does this matter? Well, Tomahawk is a cruise missile. It's quite an old cruise missile by many standards. Obviously, been evolved in iterative forms, but we're going back to the 1970s in terms of its origins. But it is long range, and it has proved highly effective, particularly as a land-based, or sort of to strike land-based targets. And so this gives Australia, for the first time, or the Royal Australian Navy for the first time, real ability to actually strike at targets from a distance. And so, for example, we talked, and Jen and I, we said we weren't going to talk about the Red Sea, but I'm going to bring it up now. So earlier this year, late last year and earlier this year, the US and the UK struck Houthi targets in Yemen. Houthi rebels were firing missiles at ships in the Red Sea. And a lot of the US strikes were done with Tomahawk missiles fired from warships. Until recently, Australia basically hasn't, even if they'd wanted to be involved in those strikes, they haven't actually had the capability very easily to do so. This all of a sudden gives them that capability. And so it really is something of a game changer in terms of Australian military capability. And it fits into very much the direction that was set out in the DSR and more recently in the NDS, the National Defence Strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's worth acknowledging that in terms of the surface combatant fleet that can actually employ Tomahawks, it will be the 3 Hobart-class destroyers and potentially the Hunter-class. So that kind of seems to be, that's an aim, but it's not clear that that's going to be the case. It may well be the case. So, I mean, it is a limited number of surface combatants that can employ that. Of course, we also know that our Hobart-class, although we call them destroyers, they only have about 48 VLS, so it's going to be a trade-off in terms of putting Tomahawks in, as opposed to SM2s and SM6, which is obviously a very versatile weapon. But I think it is really important to acknowledge how far the Royal Australian Navy has come in the last 12 months in terms of its missile capability. And I was kind of asked about this yesterday by a journalist. And I'm not a naval historian. You're a naval historian. But I do think it is, like, the term historic was used, I think, in one of the press releases yesterday. And I actually think that's true in terms of the rapid change in the missile capability of the Royal Australian Navy. I can't think of a similar era, even the FFG upgrade going back a little bit now to kind of 2011 kind of thing, when we started putting SM2s on the FFGs. In the last 12 months, we've had a naval strike missile added to a number of ships. How many, it's not entirely clear. But Anzacs and destroyers test fired at RIMPAC. We've seen the development in terms of the announcement of, and I think we might get into this a bit later, but NSM is going to be built in Australia, which is fantastic. We've seen the announcements about the SM Charlie and the SM6 early this year. Now, we did know that was coming, but it's kind of moved along. Definitely, we've seen the SM6 firing at RIMPAC, and now we've seen the Tomahawk firing. I think that is a rapid development in terms of the RAN's capability. And I think that, those things are never actually easy to achieve. So I think a lot of people have probably worked a lot of weekends, a lot of late nights to make that happen. But it has transformed the capability that the Navy currently has. And I think that's important to acknowledge amongst, the structural issues that we know the Navy has in terms of not enough surface combatants, issues with mine warfare, issues with hydrography, we can never pronounce that, issues with replenishment. I think, what they have done is tried to optimize the capabilities that they currently have. And I think that's pretty impressive.
And they've done so fast, right? That's the real thing. We often, in the commentariat, the easy chairs that we sit in, certainly that I sit in, love to critique for being slow. And at times, I think that's valid. I think that there has been a lot that's taken too long. And so it's absolutely on us when stuff works and works really well to point that out and to highlight how successful this has been. And let's just hope that this gets rolled out across the fleet quickly enough. That the other question with this is also that they buy enough missiles to make it worthwhile. As I understand it, we've currently an order for 200 is what we've got from American documents, because obviously the Australians would never actually release how many missiles they require.
To be fair, it is actually in the press release.
Excellent.
And we're leaving this in. It's in the press release. It says 200. I actually think that the breakdown, I think I read somewhere the breakdown was about 20 Block 4 and over 200 Block 5 Tomahawk. But, I mean, that's, considering we only have 3 ships that can employ them with 48 VLS each, that's a pretty sizable order.
It is, until you start looking at the number that the Americans fire at the start of
Fair point.
any of the relatively small conflicts that they've done in, or attacks on Syria for chemical weapons use or anything like that. So yes, it's good, important step forward, but I do think this is where the point which I think we'll come to next, which is around the starting of work on the NSM factory in Newcastle, is also very important, that we have the ability not merely to fire these things, but also to produce and contribute to the wider production arsenal.
I agree. Two more points on the Tomahawk. One, also one of the things that hasn't been talked about, and it's not worth delving into now. And I'm sure we're going well over time in this podcast, our Christmas podcast. People might need to listen to it in multiple iterations. But one of the things that we haven't really talked about is the range of the Tomahawk fundamentally changes how Australia needs to think about targeting. I won't go completely into targeting, but it is now beyond a range at which the commanding officer of the ship is making decisions to employ that weapon. And so I think that it's not really clear the back-end transformations that are occurring to be able to effectively employ that weapon. They may well have occurred, but I think that's an important point to note in terms of how much Tomahawk changes. The other thing I just do want to flag is, HMAS Brisbane that has done this Tomahawk firing has been in the US for 5 months. They're on their way back. They're actually going to miss Christmas, is my understanding. So I kind of wanted to say BZ to HMAS Brisbane as well in terms of achieving this firing. The crew has clearly done a really good job, and they're going to miss Christmas. Moving on to Naval Strike Missile being bid out of Newcastle.
So I think it's a pretty short one, but we've flagged before as part of the GWIO, Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Initiative, there is going to be a factory being built in Newcastle to manufacture naval strike missile. This is the new kind of premier anti-ship missile, which is being adopted by the Royal Australian Navy, as we've already flagged. And again, coming back to this point about stuff happening pretty quickly, this announcement was only relatively recently, and construction is already starting. There's pictures of people in hard hats with diggers. Now, whether or not that actually means construction starting, who knows? But they're at least announcing that this is going to happen. Construction of the factory is scheduled to be completed by the end of 2026. So again, in the grand scheme of things, that's relatively rapid, with production starting in 2027 and full production capacity being reached by 2028. So I think, again, this is definitely a good news story. There are obviously issues and challenges with it in terms of everything from kind of workforce and things like this, but all the way through to supply chain challenges around sovereignty in terms of capability. But it is definitely a good step forward and fits into a number of the other stories that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is really positive. I think that the naval strike missile decision was a great decision. And I think the idea of producing it here is fantastic. And that kind of links into another announcement we've seen this week from a coastal defence perspective. The government has come out and talked about this transition of the Australian Army into more of a not only maritime focus, because armies do lots of things. And I think in this discussion about armies pivot towards being maritime focused, we're losing a discussion about all the other important things that they do. So I am giving a shout out to the army. But the announcement this week was about the 2nd Long Range Fires Regiment, which is kind of a key focus in terms of that pivot of army towards the maritime. It was announced that the government will select the 2nd Long Range Fires element to have either two options in terms of capabilities. One is the PrSM, or the Precision Strike Missile, fired from the HIMARS launcher vehicle. But the second option, which seemed to be a surprise to some, I don't track this particularly closely, but the second option was the Naval Strike Missile fired from the Strike Master launcher vehicle, which has got to be fairly popular, I would think, given that we're going to be building the NSM here. Now, in terms of this decision of which vehicle and capability is going to be acquired by the 2nd Long Range Fires Regiment for Army will be decided in 2025, and it does complement the August 23 decision for the 1st Long Range Fires Regiment to be equipped with 42 HIMARS launchers effectively. So, look, I think that's another example of kind of getting after some of those changes in the Defence Strategic Review, and fairly positive.
Yeah, I would be shocked, to be honest with you, if they don't go with the NSM option, particularly as it is launched off Strike Master, is a modified version of the Bushmaster, which is an Australian-produced vehicle. So there are very considerable both kind of sovereignty and manufacturing, but also economic and political advantages to going with that particular option. So I would, with no inside knowledge, but certainly from the flagging and the way it's been presented, I would be quite surprised if that is not the option taken. They mention here that in the announcement that this is equipped with land-based long-range fires.
Yeah, it does. And we're going to have a bit of an abbreviated did you know, but we just want to talk about the concept of long range. Don't get me wrong, I think that this is a significant transformation in terms of the Australian Army's capability. But so PrSM, the Precision Strike Missile, is kind of greater than 500 kilometers. Exactly the range, not sure, not clear, in the unclassified environment. The Naval Strike Missile is about 185 kilometers in the unclassified environment. So I just want to talk about this concept of long range, because increasingly, when we talk about any missile in the Australian Defence Force, we hear this term long range. And in the press release for this down select to the two options for the 2nd Long Range Fires Regiment for Army, we talk about PrSM and we talk about Naval Strike Missile. Now, when you talk about the definitions of ranges of missiles, look, there's a bunch of different references and some of them are kind of conflicting, right? But broadly, and if you go off kind of the Arms Control Association website, broadly the understanding seems to be that short-range missiles are anything up to about 1,000 kilometers. Now, some other references say, no, it's 500 kilometers. Above 500 kilometers is actually medium range. But most people would say a short-range missile is something less than 1,000 kilometers. A medium-range missile is something kind of between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers, and a long-range missile is generally above 3,000 kilometers. Kind of cuts off at 5,500, depending on where you then bring in intercontinental ballistic missiles into this conversation, right? So there is. These aren't the go and do your exam. These are the exact answers. There are different views on this. Some of the key references include kind of the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is a volunteer regime that Australia is a part of. Now it talks about different categories for missiles. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which is actually between the US and Russia. It's no longer enforced in 2019. We won't go into all of that. But the key point I just want to highlight is when we talk about this idea of definitions of missiles by their range, generally we talk about short range being less than 1,000 kilometers, medium range being kind of between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers, and long range being above 3,000 kilometers. So when you think about the missiles in that have entered the inventory of the Australian Defence Force this year, so SM-6, for example, it's a short-range missile. Naval Strike Missile, it is a short-range missile. Now, that's an increase on the range of the Harpoon missile, which is about 124 kilometres in the unclassified domain, depending on how you're employing it. But they are short-range missiles. The Tomahawk missile is certainly a medium-range missile, and depending on how you cut it, you can actually make the argument for it being a long-range missile. But certainly you can't make the argument for the Naval Strike Missile being a long-range missile. Anyway, that's quite a diatribe on the did you know, but I just think we just need to be a little bit careful when we're talking about the ranges of missiles, because there is this tendency to say, we're getting after long-range fires, we've got the Naval Strike Missile, and it's just not a long-range missile.
I think it's a valid point, particularly when you then start looking at the strategic ideas and rationale behind the DSR and the NDS, actually, and the geographic scale of the region in which we operate. This stuff matters, and we need to be clear that yes, there will be rhetoric coming out of both defence and out of the government around elements of this, but when we actually start talking about, well, what does this actually offer you in terms of capability? Something that's got a range of 125 miles is very different from something that's got a range of 2,500 kilometres and offers you very different kind of capabilities. It's just worth I guess, a reality check on some of the rhetoric.
I agree. And on that, I think this has been a very long episode, so maybe it's a Christmas special. But I think that's all we have time for. So thanks so much, Richard. Thanks for season 1 and the 22 episodes. It's been good fun.
Absolutely. Thanks again, and we will hopefully be back in the new year.
Absolutely. And you missed your cue to say Maritime Matters.
I left it to you.
22 episodes and you still haven't got it up. Anyway, thanks, Richard. Have a wonderful Christmas.
Cheers. You too, Jen.